Hi, my name is Bill Berloni, and this is my life in the theater. Hey, everybody, what y'all doing? Hi, 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 hi. Well, wow, this is something. I tend not to look back, so this is going to be an interesting experience. Recently, I sent my bios into Playbill for my latest 2 shows, and in it I've done 27 Broadway productions, and my daughter came to see the show and she said, "Dad, you did 33. So I tend not to look back. Here we go. Annie. Moments in your life that will change the course forever. In 1977, Annie opened at the Alvin Theater. I was 20 years old. Up until then, I thought I would be an inspiring actor. And I was an apprentice at the Goodspeed Opera House in East Haddam, Connecticut, where the show was originally done. My second summer there, and they hired me back for no money. They were doing this new musical because the Goodspeed is dedicated to the American musical and the creation of new musicals. And they had picked this show that had a dog in it, and it was the 3rd show of the season. And the producer at the time, Michael Price, looked to hire a New York dog trainer, and they were very expensive. So then he went to the paid staff members there and the carpenters and the prop people and said, "You guys got to train the dog," and they all threatened to quit. So basically he needed a sucker. I was 19 years old, second summer there, and I remember being called into his office. Now, I'd never been called into his office. And he sat me down in his chair and he said, "You've done great work here, Bill, and I know you want to be an actor, and how would you like a part in one of the shows and your equity card?" I was blown away. I thought, my God, he's a genius. He recognizes my acting ability by the way I've been building scenery. This is, of course, Mr. Price, of course. And I would love that. And he goes, "All you have to do is find and train the dog for the new show." I'm like, okay, yes, absolutely. And the discussion continued, and he said, "Here's $35 to find and feed the dog all summer." And I went, okay. Well, it was the summer of 1976. I had never trained a dog, and it took me a week to realize what I had sort of agreed to. And someone said they had cheap dogs at the animal shelter. So one day, I took the shop van and a Polaroid camera, and I went to shelters looking for the original Sandy. I grew up on a farm. I'm an only child. I had a dog who was my best friend, a cat, a rabbit. I grew up with animals as my companions, not as my pets or property. So as I started going to animal shelters, I was depressed because I'd go to these places and I'd see these dogs in horrible conditions, in dirty cages and skinny. And as the day progressed, I went from shelter to shelter, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing, that we treated our animals so badly. So I ended up at the Connecticut Humane Society at the end of the day, and it was a place with 100 runs, 50 dogs on each, and of course, imagine the smell and the noise. And I got to the end of one of the runs, and there was a dog who wasn't barking, and he sort of caught my eye, and he was sort of sandy colored. And I went over and I knelt down, and he came over and he sniffed my hand, and the attendant came down, and the dog ran away. And so we went to the office, and I said, "Hi, my name is Billy Berloni. I'm looking for a dog for a new play, and I have to take pictures to get the director's approval." And the guy looked at me, he said, "Do you want the dog?" I said, "Well, no, I have to take a picture of him because he has to be approved for the show." And he was like, "Well, he's being put to sleep tomorrow." And I said, "What?" "Yeah, his time's up. He's going to be put to sleep." And in that moment, I just never knew dogs had expiration dates and that we were putting animals down. And I said, "Well, can I put a deposit down on him?" And he said, "No." And I said, "How much is it?" And the adoption fee was $7. And I reached in my pocket and I had $3 because I'd had lunch. And when he saw I had $3, he kicked me out. So I ran back to the Opera House, and Michael Price was out of town, and the director and creator, Martin China, was out of town, and there was nobody to okay this dog. And that night at the show, I was complaining to everybody about what I saw, and they were like, ugh, blowing me off. So later that night, we lived in the tech house, and my roommate said, "Here, idiot, here's the $4. Go back tomorrow morning and adopt him," which is what I did. Went back the next morning when they opened and adopted Sandy. Well, he had been abused, so he was afraid of people. So imagine me coming back to the Goodspeed Opera House, dragging this dog in, going, "Hey, everybody, I found Sandy." Well, picture didn't look too good to everybody, but I thought, well, you know, we feed him a little pasta, we make him think everybody's good here, and he might listen to us. And that's what happened. And, you know, I started feeding him, and he became friendly with everybody. Everybody gave him cookies. And then we had our first rehearsal, and the stage manager said, well, here, you've got the kid in for an hour. I had never run a rehearsal. So I came in, and at that moment, at that time, it was Kristen Vigard, who was the original Annie in the show. And she looked at me, she goes, this little 12-year-old, she goes, what are we gonna do? And I said, he likes playing with balls, and so I gave her the ball, and they started playing, and that wonderful thing that happened, kids and dogs, they just sort of bonded. And again, my thought was, if I could make Sandy think the theater was his home and the kid was part of his family, he might go on stage, which is ultimately what happened. We rehearsed. The show had a very tumultuous start at the Goodspeed. The first night there was a hurricane. The generator was on, and we were holding scenery up in the dark. 2 weeks later, the New York Times came and gave it a bad review. But Sandy was happy. I was happy. I was also going to go to New York to study with Stella Adler at NYU. And then the second weekend, Martin Charning came to me and he said, Billy, I got to talk to you after the Sunday matinee. And I went, okay. So sat down, and he brought Andrew McArdle out, sat her on his lap, and asked her, how would you like to be Annie? And she said, yeah. And so we started playing. And I think back at that moment, a moment of innocence, a moment of the show must go on, and a moment that changed theatrical history. And I was there, as I have been in many, many times, but I'll never forget that moment. And so Andrea took over. The show started to change, but it didn't have a life. So Michael Price said to me, listen, kid, he's your dog, you better take him now. So Sandy and I moved to New York City in the fall of 1976, and I enrolled at NYU. Had an apartment in Greenwich Village on the 5th floor of a walk-up that didn't allow dogs. And so I snuck Sandy up to the 5th floor, and I would let him go to the bathroom up on the roof, and was living this wonderful New York actor life. And in January of 1977, I got a call from Mike Nichols' office. And they said, Martin Charning has asked if you would participate in the Broadway production of Annie. And at that point, going to NYU, I thought, any way to work with Mike Nichols and Martin Charning and Charles Strouse and Tom Meehan in a Broadway show, sure, I'll be an animal trainer. Reunited with Andrew McArdle 4 months later, on April 21st, 1977, Annie opened. And I became a world-famous animal trainer overnight at the age of 20. And that is how theater changed my life. And to see this program brings back a lot of memories. And of course, the show ran for 7 years. We did multiple touring companies. And the day I left Sandy, I made a promise to myself. And it was, when I grew up, if I ever got another dog, I would adopt it. Well, there were understudies, there were tours, and I think to date I've probably adopted about 300 animals for my career. So there's a lot of history in this one, Playbill. And yeah, and so much that gave me the life that I have now. Oh, my goodness. Oh, Alice in Wonderland. Okay, Alice in Wonderland. Oh my goodness. Directed by Eva Le Gallienne, starring Kate Burton. And they needed a pig and a cat. You know, I had done Annie, the touring companies, pretending to be an animal trainer. And the only theory that I had was if I could make them happy and make them think that they were at home on stage, that would work. There was a scene where they wanted a baby pig to be carried on by Kate Burton, held, and then run off stage. And I never had farm animals. So I did some research. There was a press agent at the time named Jeffrey Richards, who was this was his first Broadway show, and he wanted to make a splash. So he said to me, Bill, I want to have a pig audition. I'm like, what are you talking about? He said, I want people to bring their pigs in, and we're going to do this pig audition. I'm like, you can't do that. It's New York City. can't be bringing pigs in, but we might be able to create one, a fake audition. And he loved it. So we got a 4-H group who had a bunch of pigs, baby pigs, to come in. We had actors playing their owners, and we held this audition. And of course, there was one little girl who we, of course, picked as the winner, and her pig, which was the one we had already chosen ahead of time, became the pig, and we named her Hamletta, called her Hammy for short. So here I was with this baby pig, and for people who know the theater district, the Alvin is on 57th Street, the Virginia was across the street, and I had an apartment next to Victor's restaurant. I had 4 or 5 dogs there, which was already kind of crazy. I knew the landlord wasn't going to say, it's okay to bring a pig in. So we would sneak the pig in by the doorman every night. I couldn't figure out how to teach an 8-week-old pig to come on command, but we were bottle feeding it 5 times a day. And every time the bottle would come out, pig would go crazy. So I started this thing where I thought, what if I sort of condition it to come to the bottle? So I put jingle bells on the baby bottle. So wherever the pig was in the apartment, ring the jingle bells, it'd come running. And we found a little black cat who was just this little lazy cat, and she had to ride out on stage in a chair, which she did. We put her on the chair, she just sat there, came out, Kate picked her up and carried her off stage. The pig thing got a lot of attention. We would give the pig half the bottle before she went on stage. And like babies, when they have a bottle, they have that milk buzz, so the pig would be a little sleepy, Kate would carry it out, she'd do her monologue, put it down, I'd ring the jingle bells, and it run off stage. Everybody was thrilled. The show had a limited run, but Hammy started getting big. And I remember one night, I came down and she was like a little noisy, and I came down to the lobby and she started grunting. And the doorman looked at me and goes, "What's that?" I said, "Oh, it's my dog. It's got a cold." He went, "Oh, really? Is he okay?" I'm like, "Yeah, he's fine, he's fine." So, for the last week of Hammy's career, doorman always checked in to make sure my little dog was okay. They ultimately filmed it for PBS, and Richard Burton came in and played the White Knight, and it was the first time I got to meet Richard Burton. And again, being in the presence of such amazing, legendary talents like Eva Gallion and Kate was my first foray into my non-canine animal training career. Oliver. Oliver. That has a great story. Patty LuPone, Ron Moody, the original director, and I forget his name, but Cameron McIntosh had acquired the rights to Oliver, and it was his first Broadway production. He was very eager for it to be popular. And they brought over the London set, and there's a dog named Bullseye, a bull terrier. And so we adopted one little girl who was very sweet, and we needed a backup. And the only other bull terrier I could find, I had a friend who worked at the ASPCA, and they had just broken up a dog fight, and they had this bull terrier, and he was deaf. And it was the only dog I could find, and I had to fulfill the contract. So we adopted this dog thinking he can never be with the other dog, he can never be around other dogs, and he's never gonna go on, right? We called him Vito. So as we were rehearsing, there was no real rehearsal in the rehearsal room. We waited till we got to the theater during tech rehearsal because the dog needed to pattern on come on stage, go up a set of stairs, across the bridge, down the stairs, and off. Our little female was so sweet with everybody, but as tech got behind, we weren't getting the rehearsal time that we needed because I asked for twice a day. We were getting maybe one every other day, and she just wasn't getting it. And I was getting very worried, and I was telling management, but the production stage management team just didn't seem to prioritize that. So the first preview, she went out and did the pattern, and then the audience reacted, and she looked, and she went off, and she came to me, and she seemed upset by it. And I'm like, okay, you see the audience isn't going to hurt you. The second performance came, and she tentatively went on, got to the top of the stairs, turned around and came back. And of course, I'm asking for rehearsal and just not getting it. Third preview. She didn't even go on. She didn't even go on for this bit. And I'm backstage, it's a matinee, and I'm just like, what am I gonna do? And there's a knock at my door and somebody comes in. This man comes in and goes, what the F is going on here? Why isn't that dog doing it? And I went, who are you? And he went, I'm Cameron McIntosh and I'm paying you. And I said, well, I haven't gotten rehearsal. And we got into this thing where when I explained to him I haven't had rehearsal, he went, well, I'll get you rehearsal today. I was like, okay. So I waited around in between shows. Guess what? Rehearsal didn't happen. Dog didn't go on to the preview that night. Again, he comes busting into my dressing room. What are we gonna do about this dog? You know, you're not doing your job. And I'm like, I didn't get rehearsal. And so he said, you will have it tomorrow before tomorrow night's show. Now, the little dog was obviously done. And I looked at Vito, the deaf dog who was like sitting in his little carrier, happy as could be, thinking this is the end of my Broadway career, because how do you get a dog to do a behavior in a Broadway show with one rehearsal? So that Thursday I came in, had the stage at 5, and he was a happy boy, you know, loved people. During the daytime, I'd let him out in my yard and I could call him, he'd see me, but at night he couldn't see me, so I would take a flashlight out, and you know, when he was out in the yard. And one night he started chasing the flashlight beam, and that was my way of exercising him. I'd have him run all over the yard. So I go to the theater, and I'm like, maybe. So I take the flashlight and I trace the light up the stairs, across the bridge, down the other stairs, and meet him on the other side and give him a cookie. He like does it once. We do it again, does it twice. Third time, I don't even use the flashlight. I go to the other side, he runs across. And I'm like, oh my God, this might work. This just might work. And I said, but he'll never, with all the lights and the people and everything, he's gonna be freaked out and he's just not gonna do it. And we got to Thursday night's performance. My assistant let Vito go. He ran across, did the whole bit, and was perfect. And I was like, oh my God, he's deaf, so he didn't hear the audience. He didn't hear the people. He had no idea what was going on. He was just coming to the cookie. And he was hence known as Saint Vito, because I never spoke to Cameron McIntosh again, but he saved certainly my career in one rehearsal. And it was a fun show, all the kids and all the dogs, but yeah. That was the one where I thought my career was over, folks. Next, Chitty, Chitty, Bang, Bang. Another family classic children's show, had played a big part in my career throughout. And in this, it was Cubby Broccoli's envision to create it into a musical, and then when he passed away, his daughter brought it to America. And oh God, what a cast. It had Raul Esparza, Aaron Dilley, Jan Maxwell, Mark Kudish. But my task was to create a pack of dogs that would come into the scene of the chocolate factory and disrupt it. And so after they looked at the budget, we felt like we could afford 10 dogs, 8 dogs that could actually be on stage, 2 as backups. It sounds easy, but where do you live in Manhattan with 10 dogs? And how do you move 10 dogs from one apartment to the theater and back? And the fun part of my job was always thinking out of the box. So I found a space in Brooklyn that was a live-in warehouse, and it was 2 floors. And I lived on one floor with half the dogs. My other trainer lived on the bottom floor with the other half of the dogs. We rented a box truck, and we customized it with cages, and we were in Brooklyn. Over in Red Hook. So, you know, we would drive this box truck into Times Square with all these dogs and then load them into the theater, overcrowded with scenery. And I remember there was no dressing room for us, so they took a part of the basement and about half the size of this room and built a wall of cages, so there was like enough room for them to be in and for us to stand. The whole point of it was they had to go and congregate in one spot. And so the actor playing Lord Scrumptious is this brilliant, amazing, animal-loving actor named Ken Cantor. And when we came to him and said, Ken, you know, you're gonna have to be basically the treat pouch on stage that all the dogs are gonna run to. You're gonna have treats in your pocket and they're all gonna jump on you. And he was like, bring them on. And Ken would come to our dressing room and fall on the floor and they would lick his face. And he was just the sweetest, kindest, dog magnet that you could imagine. So there were one or two bits where the dogs would come across. One dog particularly would chase the car when it was running, and another dog would go across a passerelle. But the big scene was where they all came on stage and jumped on Ken. And it worked brilliantly every night. And there were other actors in the cast to help get them off stage at time. And it was just this whole thing of the kids and the dogs and the living in a warehouse and coming in a box truck to Broadway, where I thought this stuff was supposed to get easier as you got older, as opposed to getting just bigger and bigger. But the show is memorable to me because I went back to what Jeffrey Richards taught me about having auditions for publicity. And I said to the show, I'd like to hold an open call for dogs for the show, but shelter dogs only. And they were like, what? I said, I want to invite all the shelters in New York City to come bringing the dogs they think would be right for the show so that I could audition them and adopt them. And that's what we did. We had a big audition at the Hilton, and 10 shelters brought dogs that they thought would work for our show. And this was one of the shows where I wanted to hire a pit bull. So the first dog we hired was this big female pit bull who was this big mother dog, and she became the leader of the pack because she loved all the other dogs. And we had a collie, we had beagles, we had cocker spaniels, we had poodles, we had collies. I mean, all dogs that would technically be in the English countryside, but all 10 of them were adopted from shelters. Ultimately, 2 of them were placed in other homes, but the other 8 lived with us their entire lives, and they continued to work in other shows for us. So I'm particularly proud about the fact that it was the first animal shelter audition held for Broadway. That was a wonderful, wonderful show. Gypsy, oh my goodness, Gypsy. There's an interesting story with Gypsy. First off, it was Bernadette Peters version, directed by Sam Mendes. And of course, I had volunteered at the very first Broadway Barks, and I was working for the Humane Society of New York. And we brought our dogs to the shelter, and the very first one, they bring the dogs up on stage. And I was leading the dogs up on stage, the steps to the stage in Schubert Alley. And I get there, and Bernadette Peters goes, you're Bill Berloni. And I thought, yeah. She goes, you need to be on stage with us. You're a celebrity. So from the very first Broadway Barks, I would participate with Bernadette and this wonderful cause for rescuing animals. So when Gypsy came along, of course, there was no question, she wanted me to work on the show. In the original production, there is a Yorkie, so we got 2 small Yorkies and a baby lamb. And I was figuring out how I was going to do this. And Bernadette said, and Bill, she goes, these baby lambs, I want to make sure they don't end up being eaten. I want them to live on a farm the rest of their lives, so they can't be, and I was like, oh, okay. I had no idea where I'm going to get baby lambs. I had no idea if I was going to have a backyard full of lambs, but I had to fulfill this problem that these baby lambs would live happily ever after. So my wife and I started doing searching, and we found a sheep milk farm that creates sheep milk cheese up in Chatham, New York. And it's one of the only ones in the world. And what they do is they have this breed of sheep, they breed them. When the babies are born, they take the babies away and milk the mothers, and the female babies are kept and raised to be used, and the male babies are sold off. So we went to them and we told them this situation. They're like, well, sure, you want to borrow a baby female lamb or a male? I said, well, we want the females because we want them to live. We created this relationship. So imagine rehearsing a show, and again, Little Dog was easy. Bernadette carried it around. But we'd get these lambs when they were 8 days old, this big. Diaper them, bottle feed them five times a day. By the time they were like 15 days old, they were sturdy enough to bring to rehearsal. And I had remembered from Alice in Wonderland, you feed an animal a baby bottle, they go to sleep. So we would give that baby bottle, we'd give the little lamb the whole bottle of milk, so she'd be really sleepy, so that when Louise sang the song Little Lamb, she would sleep in her arm the whole time. And it all worked out beautifully. It was a beautiful production. Bernadette was great. Everybody was great. We went through 23 baby lambs through the run of the show because they would last a month. And every month I'd go back up to the Chatham farm and take pictures of the lambs to show Bernadette, see, they're still alive. But I thought going through Times Square with 8 dogs was funny. Going through Times Square with a baby lamb in a baby carriage, yeah, I was that guy. It also had significance because the last Miss Hannigan in the Broadway production of Annie was June Havoc, the original Dainty June. So I had a connection to this story and the past, and so to see Bernadette play it was just amazing. One of the greatest actresses, one of the greatest musicals of ever. I do have another favorite memory about Gypsy. It was the only time I did a Stephen Sondheim show. Obviously one of the theater greats. And we did the big meet and greet, and the room was filled with people, and we did the read-through. And so everybody came in, and everybody got all the good seats, and I had the dogs, and there was no place to sit except behind Bernadette. That was like the worst seat in the house if you were gonna go to read-through. So I'm like, okay, I'll sit here. So I'm sitting behind Bernadette, and they start the read-through, and I look over to the far corner, and Stephen Sondheim sitting over there in a chair by himself. And I start watching him. I start watching him, seeing the reading of his show being reinvented with this whole new cast, and just watching this musical genius see his work come to life, and the things he liked and the things he didn't like. I'm like, that's worth the price of admission. So that was my only encounter with Stephen Sondheim, but it was so memorable and so telling about the genius of this man and the work that he created. Legally Blonde. Oh my God, you guys. The show that changed my life was Annie. My favorite musical ever is Legally Blonde. I remember the very first day of rehearsal, Jerry Mitchell got everybody in the room, and he said, listen guys, it's not Les Mis. It's Legally Blonde, so it's gonna be fast, it's gonna be funny, it's gonna be furious, let's go. And that's what it was. It was just this joyous, wonderful experience. But it didn't start off that way for me. 2 years before they started, I got the call from Jerry Mitchell, introducing himself, saying he was doing Legally Blonde, and they were looking for a bulldog and a chihuahua to play the roles. And I went, well, great. I said, what are you thinking about in terms of the dog? He said, well, I've got this idea. Bruiser, the chihuahua, we start out in the sorority house, and they can't find Elle Woods. And Bruiser comes out and tells them where she is. And I had never met Jerry. I was like, tells them where she is? Yes, he's got lines. Really, Jerry, the dog has lines. Yes. How many? 5 lines. But Jerry, what if he misses a line or something? The play stops, he goes, you'll figure it out. Okay. We start looking for chihuahuas. And the search starts in about a year before. There was a shelter in Newark, New Jersey called the Associated Humane Society. It's a very high-kill shelter. We try to adopt a lot of dogs from them. And they called and they said they had this blonde chihuahua. So I drive all the way from Connecticut down to Newark. I get there and the executive director comes out and she goes, listen, Bill, I'm sorry. The dog they called you about is really not good for you. You know, he's reactive and he's a biter, and we feel so and they were so sorry. I said, well, let me see the dog. You know, I just didn't want them to feel bad. I go into the facility and there's a room to the right, glass cages, and they're going, he's in there. Okay, I thought somebody would like bring me in, and so I go in, and the 2 rows of cages. In the upper cage there's a blonde chihuahua, and his name is Chico. So I go over, and Chico lunges at the cage towards me. Now, a normal person would react and go, okay. People looked up to me, and I thought, if I act like I can't handle this dog, it would seem like I really didn't know what I was doing. So, you know, I started my stuff where I calmed my breathing down. I got near the cage, I put my back to him. I just stood there for a while, and eventually he came over and he sort of sniffed my shoulder. Okay, cool. And I thought, does he need a walk? and they threw a leash into the room. Now, he's this 9-pound Chihuahua, and the staff members are like afraid of him. So I get the leash, and you know, he's on an upper cage, so I slowly open the door, and he's in the back. You know, it's going well. And in that split second, I see him coming towards me, and I'm thinking, I'm gonna get bit in the face, because he's coming right towards my face. He comes and he leaps into my arms. And I slowly get him away from my face. I slowly hook the leash on. I put him down, and he becomes this attack dog. He's like, and people move as I'm like leading him out into the street. And the Association of Humane Society is on this street where there's a lot of warehouses, a lot of tractor trailer trucks. And so I'm walking him down. He's very happy to be out, and he's peeing on everything. We get to the end of the street, we turn around, and just then a tractor trailer truck starts up and the air brakes go, and he runs over and he bites the tire. He bit the tire. And I thought, you poor thing, you must have had to really defend yourself, you know, to be this angry. And so, you know, I calmed him down, and he looked up at me. And I knew that type of dog with that type of reactivity was going to be euthanized. So I went back in and I said, listen, you know, he's probably not right for the show, but I'd like to foster him and maybe work with him and find him a home, which is what we did. So we continued to look for more Chihuahuas, and Chico came home and just became a nightmare. You know, he hated my wife, Dorothy, would go after her constantly, loved me, beat up the other dogs. I mean, he was just one of those dogs I wanted to find a home for. 2 months later, the producers called and said, Jerry Mitchell's going to be on Good Morning America, and he wants to announce the show, and he wants a Bruiser. I said, well, I don't have a Bruiser. You know, I mean, we've got this little dog, and he's really not right for the show. Bring him. I'm like, no, you don't understand. He's just not right for the show. Just bring him. It'll be fine. You know. And I hung up the phone, and Dorothy said, my wife said, are you out of your mind? You can't bring this dog to ABC. He's going to bite somebody. I was like, what do we do? We don't have any other Chihuahua. The morning comes, and I'm really nervous. And again, Chico is bonded with me. He's fine. We come in, and everybody's coming, hey, how are you? So we're waiting. Jerry goes to hair and makeup. He comes out, and he sees Chico, and he goes, Bruiser! And before I could tell Jerry Mitchell to stop and go slowly, he falls down on his knees. Chico runs up to him, jumps into his arms, starts kissing him. I mean, and in that moment, I thought, he's going to bite Jerry Mitchell. But he picked him up, licking his face. He goes on camera. He does this thing, and he comes off. He goes, we found our Bruiser. I'm like, oh, no. So that's how Chico got the role. Needless to say, he had the temperament to walk onto a stage and not be afraid of anything. We found another little dog named Boo, called him Boo, little Pomeranian Chihuahua mix. And so we had our 2 dogs. And Chico barked all the time. He was one of those dogs that would bark and make you crazy. The trick was getting him to shut up. And as I was trying to figure out how to get a dog to do lines, you know, it dawned on me, instead of teaching a dog to speak, if I could teach Chico to be quiet, if I gave him permission to go on stage and bark and then told him when to be quiet, it might work. And that's what we did. Chico would come out and he'd bark, and we worked with Anna Lee Ashford, who played the original Margot, who did that scene with her. And if you watch any of the videos, she puts her hand down. Her hand in front of his face was a signal to stop barking. So he'd come out barking, and she'd tell him to stop. And then she'd release his hand, he'd bark and stop. And then we had Laura Bell Bundy, who, again, another animal person at heart, was one of those people who he recognized immediately was a friend, as was Kristen Borle, who, you know, it was a cast of dog-loving people, and Chico ultimately felt safe and secure with that bunch of people. So we never worried about him biting anyone. But the first day of rehearsal, there was this person who was playing Paulette. I had no idea who she was. And I looked, and she's over, like, messing with the understudy dog. And I said, excuse me, you're really not supposed to. She goes, I'm taking this dog when the show's over. I mean, that was her first words to me. I'm taking this dog when the show's over. I said, no, you're not. I don't, who are you? What are you doing? And she was doing a scene with the bulldog. So Paulette and Andy Carl worked with the bulldog, and we had a dog named Chloe who was just a slobbery mess of a dog. And the two of them, Orfeh and Andy, loved this big bulldog. And what was not scripted one time was Orfeh picked up the bulldog and it was like licking her face on stage, and everybody loved it. But she kept saying to me, I'm taking Boo when the show's over. I said, no, you're not. So joyous sort of rehearsal process. Everybody was lovely, exciting. I'm 45 years old, hanging out with 20-year-olds. It's like great stuff. And we go to San Francisco for our tryout. And this is important because Jerry Mitchell credits me with giving him one of the endings to the best Act 1 ending he's ever had. What was scripted was that Elle Woods is singing So Much Better, and on the last note, they wanted Bruiser to come out to her and jump in her arms, and that's the way the first act was going to end. And I kept saying, but Jerry, she's singing out front. She needs to give the dog a cue to come out. He won't be able to do it. So it was one of those cues that was kind of tentative. He was doing it, but he wasn't really doing it. We got through our tech period. First preview in San Francisco. The theater is packed. It is clear there is a following for Legally Blonde. They are all blondies. So we're there, and the overture starts. It's a rock concert. People are screaming. They're going crazy. Chico comes out. Now, my little newer tough guy dog comes out, and they go crazy. And he was like, he had no idea what that crowd roar was. But then Anna Lee Ashford was like, got him back and got him looking, and but it almost scared him to the point where he didn't want to go on stage anymore. So we get to the end of the first act, and now there's no other people on stage. It's just Laura Bell in a spotlight, and he's like, I have him in the wings, and he's looking up at me. Do I really have to go out there? They're going to yell again. I had a feeling it wasn't going to happen, and I turned to the stage manager next to me. I said, tell the PSM dog's not coming out. Relayed it over to the PSM. Laura Bell didn't know. She was holding the note. She looked at me and went, and she was standing there. She hit the end of she didn't know what to do, but she jumped up in the air, and the PSM called the blackout, and it was brilliant. And so Jerry Mitchell credits me for not sending the dog out, for giving him the best ending to the first act he's ever had. And it just proceeded to go on to be this wonderful, wonderful experience. We played at the Palace. We did the national touring companies. We had 5 or 6 Bruisers. We had Bulldogs. We still have Bruisers and Bulldogs. But about a year into the show, Orfeh said, well, my contract's up. I'm leaving. I'm taking Boo. I'm like, no, you're not. I said, you're not. He's contracted to the show. You can't leave the show. She was like, really? You may have to stay till we close to get that dog? I was like, yes, you do, if you want the dog. So she did stay to the end of closing. Closing day, she came upstairs to the 6th floor of the Palace Theater. She picked him up. She said, see ya, and she took Boo home. Well, obviously, we had vetted her out. We knew that she loved Chihuahuas. She had 3 or 4 of them. Andy was okay with it. And Boo lived with them for another 10 or 12 years. And, when he passed, they were very... But there was a case where, Boo was happy on our farm being one of 25 dogs, but I knew that he'd have a better life being one of Orfeh's dogs. That's one of the only experiences where I've ever let an actress or actor take one of my animals home when the show's closed. Because how could you say no to Orfeh? A Christmas Story. A movie that I had watched, and it was the first Broadway score for these young composers named Pasek and Paul. A friend of ours in Connecticut had acquired the rights and was producing it, Jerry Gehring, and he called me up. He said, Bill, I got the rights to do this movie. We need bloodhounds to do the Bumpus Hounds. And I'm like, no thanks. He said, what do you mean? I said, are you kidding? Bloodhounds? Hounds? Hounds don't listen to anything. You can't do it. But Jerry, I can't train bloodhounds to do your show. They moved forward with it. They premiered in Seattle, and they used puppets. Apparently the show was very good, except for the puppets. So it was transferring back to New York, and he called me and said, Bill, you've got to you've got to help us. I'm like, oh, bloodhounds. I said, they only will go in one direction, and they'll only go for food. So we had to really go back into rethinking how to get blocking in one direction. And obviously we did a search. We found a bonded pair of bloodhounds up in Toronto, Pete and Lily. Beautiful dogs. They chased the character of the old man, who was John Bolton, who again is another animal-loving, wonderful human being. The idea was nobody talked to the dogs except for John. So John would come in and just lay on the floor, and they'd slobber all over him, and we'd give him treats. And so it was one of those wonderful, loving experiences. But the whole point is that the dogs have to destroy Christmas turkey in order for them to go to the Chinese restaurant. And so creating a safe pattern with two dogs chasing food together was precarious, because you don't want them fighting over the food, you don't want them fighting over the guy, you don't want them fighting over this stuff. And so we had a turkey carcass, and we would put dog food inside it. We trained them to do this pattern, and it was very choreographed. Because if John moved the pan too fast, they would lose interest. If he moved it too slow, they would get upon him. And we figured out a way to make this work. It was the first time I worked with John Rando, who was our director, and he was lovely. He let us choreograph this whole thing. But the day before press started coming, I come in, and they go, Bill, we've changed the exit on stage left. I'm like, what do you mean you changed the exit? Well, what used to be a 10-foot exit in one was now a 6-foot exit. And I turned to everybody, I said, you can't change this. The dogs, they're not smart. They won't figure this out. And they said, and it became this thing where I was like, guys, this is not gonna work. So we ran it with John Bolton, and of course the dogs now exiting couldn't exit side by side, they had to exit on the back. And so we rehearsed it, and they kind of did it, but I'm thinking to myself, I hope this doesn't become a problem. First critic night, audience. I mean, the dogs had been doing well in front of the audience. They go to leave, and one of them sort of slows down, and John Bolton trips and falls on him, falls on top of Pete. And there's this thing with conditioning, classical conditioning. If there's a negative reinforcer, it decreases the likelihood the behavior is going to happen again. So the next night, we get to the turkey cross, we let the dogs go, and Pete looks at me, and he doesn't go on. He's like, I'm not going on there. As much as we would rehearse it, Pete just wouldn't do that cue. But we were okay, because the other one, Lily, was doing it, and we had 9 critics nights before we opened. And so, you know, they were bonded pretty well, and it got to the night before opening. I would bring Pete to the wing, and this was the night I see Lily look at him, look at the turkey, like wonder why he's not really following. And I'm like, oh no, she's figured it out. Opening night. We get to the turkey cross. Lily looks at Pete, Pete looks at Lily, and they sit there, and no dogs enter the stage. The first time I've had a major fail, not just on Broadway, but on opening night. And Bolton covered it, it was great, but it was one of those things where people make decisions with animals, and sometimes it has really terrible effects, and they hadn't told me ahead of time. We didn't have enough time to rehearse it. So the next day, we had to come in and redesign that whole cue. We had to rechange its direction and its choreography, which cost the producers a lot of money, because once you open, you can't rehearse anymore unless you pay everybody. But it was one of those things where if it ain't fun for the animals, they don't want to do it. Well, John Bolton worked with them, made them happen, and then moving forward, you know, we did new choreography. These dogs went on to do it for many and many times, but that was the first time I had a major fail in a Broadway show on opening night. And folks, I never want to do it again. It just was the worst feeling. But everybody lived happily ever after. We're on our second set of bloodhounds. We're still doing the Christmas Story all over the country. So yeah, lovely musical, but nightmares for me. Bullets Over Broadway. The amazing Susan Stroman. What can you everybody has said everything about Susan Stroman. She is the nicest, most talented person. And I had actually worked with her prior. She did a ballet for the New York City Ballet, a Balanchine ballet called Double Feature, and we trained a little dog to participate in that. So she knew how I worked with animals, and one of the characters in the play, played by Karen Ziemba, had a little dog that had to run on and off stage. It was a big show. And we just need a quiet space for the dogs. Karen Ziemba had just lost her dog, just passed away the first day of rehearsal, and at first was like not too interested in the dogs, but after the second day where she was holding these dogs and loving them, it healed her heart. We had one named Trixie who was very calm, and we had another little one named Rocco who was crazy. So Rocco would do all the running around, and Trixie would do the lovely posing shots. So wherever you see any pictures of Karen Ziemba and Trixie, know that she was the calm one. The stunt double did all the other work. And the other person who handled the dog was Maren Maisie. Again, a beautiful light of loveliness, and she loved the dogs. And we were at the St. James. All the dressing rooms were taken, except for the one on the 7th floor. And we calculated the number of queues we had. It would have been like walking up and down the Empire State Building once a show. I was like, guys, I can't do this. I just can't. And so during tech, I set up in the lobby, and they said, we'll figure out something for you. So during the whole tech period, I'm sitting out in the lobby with the dogs, and we're getting closer and closer to opening, and we still don't have a dressing room because everything's going on. And I keep going to Stro, I can't do the show. I don't know. And so, you know, the day before our first preview, she apparently made a call. And the next day there was a little closet built in the basement for us. But apparently she had to pull a lot of favors to get us this little dressing room, which I will never forget because it allowed us to do this show and this amazing cast. And Rocco is still alive. He's still working, still crazy as ever. But one of those good old-fashioned Broadway musicals that I just cherish having been a part of. Lady Day at Emerson's Bar and Grill. The amazing Audra McDonald, the first time I got to work with her. And in this piece, she plays Billie Holiday, supposedly at the very end of her life. And she had a little dog. We had a legally blonde Chihuahua who was unemployed at that point. Her name was Roxy. So I met Audra, the producer and the director, in a rehearsal hall. We were having a lovely chat, and I bring little Roxy in, and Audra takes her. She's a dog person. Kissing her, and oh, it's all great, you know. And Lonnie Price, who's the director, said, oh, listen, Bill, all I have to do is like walk in. She holds the dog and she walks off. I'm like, okay, well, let me hear the monologue. So Audra leaves the room. She comes back in as Billie Holiday. Now she's obviously done her homework and she's got this character, and she's inebriated at the time, and she's stumbling, and she gets up to the stage and she starts talking, and she stops. She goes, Bill, she's shaking. I was like, what? And I look, and the dog's like, she's shaking violently. I'm like, what scared her? I mean, we're looking around the room to see what scared her. And there was nothing. It was a quiet room, and it dawned on me. She had met Audra McDonald, this wonderful light of love, and then all of a sudden this other person came in the room who was out of control, who was stumbling, who couldn't speak well, and the dog became afraid of that person. I mean, that's the power of that actress's performance. I mean, within that, and it took me a second to realize it. And then I said, Audra, go out and just come in as yourself. And she did. She did the same pattern, and the dog didn't shake. We literally, the training for that show was like teaching Audra to build that character slowly with Roxy, so that when she got to the point of doing the show, Roxy knew that she was just faking it. But our preset every day was, you know, half hour, knock, knock, knock. Audra, here's Roxy. They'd go in. They would do whatever bonding they did, and that dog would go out on stage. And if you wanted the dog to lick you, you just look at her and she would lick you. So she just played this inebriated character. When she needed love, she'd look at the dog and she'd lick her. But again, that was one of the most amazing acting roles I had ever seen, because it even fooled the animal in that moment. And I had always hoped to work with Audra McDonald again, and I'm getting, once again, the opportunity to do that in my newest show, the revival of Gypsy. The Ferryman, my last Broadway show before the pandemic. Transfer from London, Martin McDonough, Sam Mendes directing. They needed a a goose to come out on stage and a baby rabbit. So the goose was carried out as the Christmas goose, and the baby rabbit was in the pocket of one of the characters. We had enough time where my wife and I were able to adopt hatchlings. They had just been hatched, and if you get them when they're just hatched, they will imprint on you. So we had 3 of them. 3 in case, who knows what a goose would do. And we named them after the Schuyler sisters. We raised these 3, and these geese, they're Emlyn geese, turned out to be like 35, 40 pounds. I mean, they were big geese, and when they were mad, they were not fun. But they got used to us holding them so you could carry them. And then we got miniature bunnies. Instead of baby bunnies, we got little mini bunnies, taught it how to ride around in a pocket. What was unique about that show was that it was the first time I had an animal that had strict city permitting regulations. The avian flu had happened, and so we had to have these geese tested. They couldn't live in New York City, so they had to live outside of New York City. We found a sanctuary up in Westchester, and we would drive them in every day. And every 30 days, they'd have to have blood tests and all this sort of stuff. I say that only because I thought pushing a baby carriage with a baby pig in it or a baby lamb was funny. Pushing a carriage with 2 geese heads like sticking out, through Times Square. Now I was enjoying being the center of attention because it was fun. But yeah, I mean, honk, honk, honk. I mean, literally honking through. I think we were at the Golden. So you were right in Times Square with this wagon with geese in it and little bunnies. Brilliant show, Martin McDonough. I mean, if you're going to do a show, they say never work with animals, babies, or fire, and that show had all 3. And now we come to my latest 2 Broadway shows, the first being Left on 10th, written by Delia Ephron, directed by my friend Susan Stroman, starring Peter Gallagher and Juliana Margulies. And these are the 2 canine stars, which play the 2 dogs that were actually in Delia Ephron's life. Nessa plays Honey, who was her dog of 20 years, and Charlie plays her current dog, whose name is Charlotte. But we got a boy dog, so we named him Charlie. They're both rescues. Charlie, I adopted 6 months ago from a shelter. He had been in a foster home for a year because they said he was a biter, and we were looking for Havanese type dogs. And when I met him, I thought, you're not a biter, you're just misunderstood, you're just afraid of everybody. And we adopted another little dog whose name was Dulcie. Hi. We had a 3-week rehearsal period. It was very fast. And all the dogs had to do was get used to Juliana and Peter and bond with them so that when they got in front of an audience, they wouldn't be scared of all the people and all the noise. So the process was great. Juliana, Peter, lovely, love dogs. I can't tell you how they made my job so much easier. We started doing tech rehearsal, and on one of the entrances, something happened, and it frightened Dulcie, and she got a little stage fright. And just like the bloodhounds in A Christmas Story, once they have that experience, they don't want to go on. And so as the first 3 previews happened, it became clear that Dulcie, the other dog, other Havanese, wasn't having a good time. And I said to Stro, we have to replace her. And she's like, how? I said, I have this dog, her name is Nessa. She plays Toto in The Wizard of Oz. She's done 600 performances plus. She can walk into any theater, do a rehearsal, and go on. And at first they thought I was joking. I said, no, I want to replace her. So on a Thursday afternoon, our second week of running, Nessa came in. We ran the cue 3 times, and she did it perfectly. And then I turned to everybody and went, she's ready to go on. And they said, but it took you 4 weeks to train him? I'm like, yeah, she's an old pro. That night she went on, and she's now pretty much stealing the show every time she's on because she is so confident. She knows where her light is. She knows where the audience is. It's an autobiographical play of Delia's journey having cancer. And the dogs are brought in to help lighten the mood and also show a part of her character that is so loving. And we are having the greatest time going in every night. Our warm-up is running to the actors' dressing rooms, getting cookies. After the show's over, they run to the actors' dressing room, get cookies. And it's a wonderful show, and we're so glad to be back with Stro and being back on Broadway with this play, which is about living your life and enjoying it. Finally, I'm here with our latest 2 Broadway actors, This is Tana June, who plays Chowsy, the little Yorkie, and this is Indy, who's her understudy. Now, they may not look alike, and the character does call for a small Yorkie. And as I said earlier, I did know June Havoc, and I did hear the story of her life and, as Dainty June and all the animals she had. And you know, at that time in her life when we worked together, she had hundreds of rescued animals up on her farm. When we got the call, we called our shelters around the country, and a shelter in Indiana had this little girl. Now, they had adopted her as an owner surrender, and she had been hanging around in the office, and a local theater called and said, "We're doing Wizard of Oz. Do you have a little dog we could use as Toto?" Tana June played the role of Toto in a community theater production, and apparently enjoyed it, didn't mind being on stage. So when we called the shelter and they told the story, we were like, America's Got Talent, she's the one, we're adopting her. So when my wife, Dorothy, went out to pick them up, because I was in rehearsal for Living on Love, this little guy was there. And, you know, he was like sweet and outgoing, and so we got 2 for 1 from the shelter, because literally the understudy doesn't go on a lot. The audition consisted of going to George C. Wolfe's apartment with Audra, and meeting them, and put this one in her arms, and immediately Audra's love of animals and her experience with us came through. They were kissing each other, and she was like, you know, this is the dog. And my wife Dorothy said, well, she doesn't have a name. And you know, we knew June Havoc, and her assistant, who lived with her for many years, was Tana. So can we either call her Tana or June to remember them? And Audra said, why don't we call him Tana June? You know, that's sort of cool. So that's how she got her name. And Indy came as Indy. And so now we're in production for this show. The first thing I did was talk them out of baby lambs. Talk them out of baby lambs. And primarily because the humane laws have gotten very strict, and we follow all humane laws. And the permitting and everything to have that type of animal in New York is now overwhelming and pretty much make it impossible. We wouldn't be able to bring a lamb in long enough to be part of the show. This time around, on this particular version, we're just doing 2 sweet little dogs. And again, we've got George C. Wolfe, we've got Audra McDonald, we've got Danny Bernstein, and a company of animal-loving people. And you know, here I am today in my 47th year of providing animals for Broadway, hoping that I can continue it long into my 70s, at least until the 50th anniversary revival of Annie, and then I might be able to say this is it. But right now, these guys have made my life and given me a life. Huh. Good girl.